A lot of my videos play on the concept of irony, and so for good measure, this one won't be any different. Evolution is something that is harder and harder for creationists to touch on. The evidence is so overwhelming and the access of it so convenient nowadays that it looks stupider than ever trying to question the reality of it. What is assumed to be a good buffer against this, however, is attacks on abiogenesis, which time after time is described as an evolutionary science. The argument I would like to look at specifically in this video is the idea that abiogenesis equals spontaneous generation, an idea debunked by Pasteur in 1859 with his theory of biogenesis. That's right, biogenesis is only a theory. Anyway, let's discuss spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation holds that life forms can abruptly appear fully formed in habitat suitable for them. The most famous examples being bacteria in milk, maggots on meat, and even mice in laundry hampers laced with wheat. To the modern scientist, and even the modern layman, this is quite the laughable idea. Spontaneous generation was on the way out since around 1688, when methodological naturalism, or materialistic science, introduced measurable properties to the natural world and discarded supernatural explanations. However, all the way through that time, even persisting into the closing decades of the Enlightenment, it was the dominant and only explanation for the existence of life, and the observation of maggots, mice and mould in everyday commodities. Ironically, spontaneous generation was ultimately discarded from the scientific community around the same time as the lingering schools of thought for mainstream creation science. And perhaps even more ironically was that spontaneous generation was wholeheartedly supported and defended by the church. Why? Two reasons. 1. Spontaneous generation was a view held to be true by the Greek philosopher Aristotle. His philosophies were regarded by the pre-Enlightenment Christians much stronger than many people might realize. Methodological, experimental science's challenge of biblical dogma was almost regarded as controversial as its challenge of Aristotelian philosophy. And 2, animals appearing fully formed out of either non-life or nothing fitted well with the biblical model of creation, as little as they liked to admit it. Indeed, spontaneous generation was a tenet held and defended by the religious and most of the scientific alike well before and even for a time after Darwin's, Lamarck's or even Erasmus's theories, none of which making any definite proposition as to how life originated. Inversely, Sir Richard Owen, perhaps one of the last mainstream scientists ever to vocally challenge Darwin's theory, penned his own theory on the origin of life based on spontaneous generation.
Is my concept of the ordained continuous becoming of living things to be ignored?
But what does it mean? I don't know what it means. It means animals appearing out of thin air.
Of course, one of the greatest issues is what exactly was and is the relationship of evolutionary synthesis and the idea of spontaneous generation. The central assertion of evolution is that every eukaryote on the planet, at the very least, shares a common ancestry. This is the cornerstone of modern biology and the fact of evolution, around which theories such as natural selection are proposed. Now, since genomic sequencing reveals that all mouse and rat species, for instance, share a single flesh and blood common ancestor some 55 million years ago, and that all mouse and primate species share a common ancestor some 75 million years ago, what room is there in this fact that mice can appear fully formed with no ancestors or transition spontaneously? Put simply, there is none. If modern mice can appear on the scene without evolving or even descending, then evolution, not just the theory, but the fact, would be discredited. Put another way, spontaneous generations of animals breaks up the well-established branching tree of evolution. Charles Darwin wrote that the only challenge he could find to his branching tree was the Cambrian explosion. This was back in the time before Precambrian transitional forms were well documented and linked modern classes and phyla. Just a side note here, I always find it amusing that the Cambrian explosion, a favourite argument of creationists, was, like most creationist arguments, taken from Darwin himself. Universal common descent and spontaneous generation, as disproved by Pasteur, are mutually exclusive. Only one of the two can possibly be fact. Spontaneous generation, of course, applies to any instance where modern multicellular or even unicellular life forms originate abruptly with no blood relation to one another. This is why it is ironic that creationists think biogenesis theory discredits evolution. 1. Pasteur's proposal of biogenesis is, like all scientific facts, a theory, which is creationist jargon for must be wrong in favour of belief. 2. Spontaneous generation was church tenet, taught and defended by creation scientists. And 3. Universal common descent is dependent on biogenesis theory being a fact. The most ironic and revealing fact of all, though, is what I left until last. The majority of us would now know of the embarrassing exposure of deception by creationists during the Dover trial. In the 1987 edition of the creationist textbook, Biology and Origins, the description of creationism is as follows. Creation means that the various forms of life began abruptly through the agency of an intelligent creator, with their distinctive features already intact. Fish with fins and scales, birds with feathers, beaks and wings, etc. Later that same year, in Of Pandas and People, the first intelligent design textbook, the description of intelligent design was as follows. Intelligent design means that the various forms of life began abruptly through an intelligent agency, with their distinctive features already intact. Fish with fins and scales, birds with feathers, beaks and wings, etc. However, not many people know that after intelligent design was deemed junk science, the next edition of the book, titled The Design of Life, tried to infiltrate once again by removing all reference of a designer or intelligent agency. This is exactly what they had to say on their views on the origins of life. Sudden emergence holds that various life forms began with their distinctive features already intact. Fish with fins and scales, birds with feathers and wings, mammals with fur and mammary glands. So this is a standpoint they attempt to challenge evolution with now. Their entire argument from the beginning, the watch needs a watchmaker, is thrown out in a desperate attempt to try and wedge themselves into mainstream science against the fact of evolution. Problem is, this new term, sudden emergence, sounds eerily familiar. Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't a cogent synonym of sudden spontaneous? Yeah, they're just about one and the same meaning, alongside such words as abrupt. So what about the terms emergence and generation? Generation is normally a term used to describe collection or organization. Emergence is basically the same thing. However, intriguingly, emergence in scientific terms often refers to the construction of something from the bottom, or most simple, to a product more complex. It is the study of emergent complexity that allows us to understand the evolution of organs and other complex biological systems much better. Therefore, what we have are the neo-creationists so desperate to keep the illusion of credibility against solid fact that they discard the whole design argument and use a new definition that reveals that what they are trying to evangelize now is spontaneous generation, only different in that it uses a noun more akin to the study of evolutionary theory. So, creationists, your whole spontaneous generation argument is just like all the others. Essentially, we're rubber and you're glue. What you say bounces off us and sticks back to you. Thanks for watching, everyone. Pop in anytime.